How do people see and use rhetoric from different periods of time? This is what I will answer in this lecture. Although the discussion of history of rhetoric in the classical, medieval, and Renaissance periods is short, I will do my best to be as comprehensive as possible. At the same time, I will present you the schemas of persuasion or theories or concepts of rhetoric that we can use as frameworks for our rhetorical analysis. I hope that you will be able to appreciate the development of rhetoric and apply the concepts in everyday conversations. Let us begin the discussion in ancient Greece, where the formal study of rhetoric began. Rhetoric was part of ancient Greek society, particularly in Athens. The political life of the city-state is managed by oratory and debate. And since many men enter the political arena, there is a demand for teachers and experts of public speaking and argumentation. James Herrick noted that in Greece, rhetoric took hold as a major aspect of culture and education, a position it maintained for much of subsequent Western history. Nevertheless, training in rhetoric became the very foundation of Greek education, and eventually came to be viewed as the principal sign of an educated and influential person. Then enter the sophists, the early teachers of rhetoric. They offered training in judicial pleading to citizens arguing their claims in court. Although they provided the foundations of the rhetoric we are studying and using today, they received criticisms from known Greek scholars that time. Although sophists believed that truth emerged from a clash of arguments, they believe that reality is not objective, and that is why their teachings focus on creating arguments based on illusions and opinion rather than in knowledge and truth. This view was used to teach students to use rhetoric to deceive people and use the style of flattery to persuade. In short, eloquence is more important than to be substantial or knowledgeable. This shows that rhetoric is a kind of power, and power can be used for good or for bad purposes. And the sophists were notorious in part because they disregarded conventional Greek ideas about the moral uses of language and argument. Some of the Greek scholars who criticized the sophists were Plato and Socrates, who discussed the ethical and philosophical issues of rhetoric. Plato's assessment is that rhetoric is a sham art that imitates the true art. For Plato, a true art should have some good result, and that it leads to a good life. Rhetoric as practiced by the sophists in court is not concerned to restore the health of a sick soul, but rather to pervert the judgments of judges and juries. Socrates then redefined rhetoric as an art of influencing the soul through words, thereby transforming rhetoric into a true art. Plato believed that instead of deceiving people and creating persuasive speeches that lack foundation in justice, the goal of rhetoric should be to establish order in the individual and in the city-state. Plato recognized the great power of persuasive language, particularly when employed by a trained practitioner of rhetoric. But he also saw a great danger in this power. But the study of rhetoric doesn't end here. Although the field of rhetoric was surrounded by criticisms and condemnations, Aristotle's study on rhetoric gave rhetoric a new frame. As a response to Plato's criticisms, Aristotle wanted to teach rhetoric as a true art. If the sophists taught their students to memorize great speeches and to debate in order to learn persuasion by imitation and practice, Aristotle taught his students to investigate and to rationally discover what is persuasive in any setting. For Aristotle, rhetoric is the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. Aristotle also noted that rhetoric can be done in three different settings. The first setting is SYMBOULEUTIKON or deliberative oratory. These are speeches presented in the legislature as laws were being debated that concern the use of resources, and the solution to problems facing the city-state. The next setting is EPIDEKTIKON, or ceremonial speeches. These are speeches given to special events such as funerals, war victories, and festivals. The last setting is DIKANIKON, or courtroom pleading or forensic oratory. These are speeches done in court where there is an accusation or defense of an individual. Aside from the rhetorical settings, Aristotle also provided three artistic proofs of rhetoric: logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos refers to the proofs available in words, arguments, or logic of a speech. It also means making an inference or reasoning. Pathos means putting the audience in the right frame of mind by providing effective or emotional appeals that, given persuasive messages, their power to move an audience to an action. And finally, ethos refers to the speaker's character or personal credibility. It also refers to the speaker's intelligence, good sense, virtue, and goodwill. For Aristotle, the style of speech, its linguistic manner, should be appropriate to the occasion. Aristotle's rhetoric, as well as the developments and criticism of rhetoric in ancient Greece, provided a solid foundation on the nature, function, and standard of rhetoric. We now move forward to the other part of classical rhetoric, ancient Rome. As ancient Greece valued rhetoric in their society, rhetorical education was also important to Rome. Just like ancient Greece, rhetorical skills were one of the crucial elements in achieving and holding power, as well as in the conduct of government in ancient Rome. If Aristotle focused on the style of speech, Cicero, one of the Roman scholars of rhetoric at that time, focused on the audience as a key component of rhetoric. Thus, to create an effective speech, Cicero formulated the 5 canons of rhetoric: invention, arrangement, expression, memory, and delivery. Invention is the discovery of valid or seemingly valid arguments. According to Cicero, there are 2 approaches in finding persuasive arguments. First is the stasis system, where you analyze a case by dividing the debate into the likely issues of conflict or stopping points. Second is the topical system, where you use memory devices that can be later developed into methods for discovering arguments. Arrangement is the distribution of arguments in proper order. Here, you create a structure of your speeches and organize your thoughts. Expression is the fitting of the proper language to the invented material. Here, you determine who your audience is so you know which context or language to use. Memory is the firm mental grasp of matter and words. Most of these speeches that time were long and planned. That is why people need to memorize their speeches and rehearse them before saying it to the council. Delivery is the control of voice and body in a manner suitable to the dignity of the subject matter and style. Speeches are also considered as performances or art. The manner of delivery also depends on the style employed by the speaker. For Cicero, the use of humor demonstrates mental agility or wit, while at the same time attracting and holding the audience's interest. However, humor also runs the dual risk of offending the audience and making the orator look foolish. Above all, Cicero believes that eloquence and wisdom must be united, and that the speaker must be a broadly educated person. From Cicero, we now go to Quintilian, also one of the rhetoricians in ancient Rome. Rhetoric, according to Quintilian, is the art of the good citizen speaking well. Rhetoric here is seen in a Platonic view where rhetoric should be associated with good citizenship, and that rhetoric serves a moral function to the individual. In this perspective, Quintilian provided 5 concepts in his rhetorical education: indefinite and definite questions, bases, proof, loci, and parts of a judicial speech. Indefinite questions are questions discussed without specific reference to persons, time, place, or other particular limitation, while definite questions are issues concerning specific individuals, facts, places, and times. These questions are important in formulating argument. Bases are those specific issues or contexts addressed in resolving a judicial case. Proofs are evidence used for the arguments. Without proofs and bases, there is a weak argument, and the speech is not effective. Loci is like Cicero's topical system, but instead of using it for memorization, they were practiced repeatedly in order to develop particular habits of thought. Quintilian divided the judicial speech into 5 parts: exordium or introduction, narratio or statement of the facts essential to the understanding of the case, confirmatio or the presentation of evidence to support the claims, confutatio or refutation in which counter arguments are answered, and peroratio, which is the conclusion of the speech. Although the study and practice of rhetoric flourished during the early Roman period, rhetoric's reduction in the late Roman Empire to a method of training administrators and a form of entertainment point up an important connection between rhetoric and democracy. When democracy flourishes, so does rhetoric and its study. But when democracy declines, rhetoric also declines as its role as the method of free public discourse is diminished. If rhetoric experienced a context of democracy in the classical period, the scholastic approach during the medieval European period led to a closed and authoritarian approach to education of rhetoric. Although rhetoric was viewed with suspicion, rhetoric increasingly was identified with written style and used to assist the oral exposition of biblical texts. Rhetorical arts during the medieval period were in the form of the art of preaching, letter writing, and poetry. One of those who advocated for the use of rhetoric was Saint Augustine, who defended that rhetoric should be used for church teaching, debating with opponents, and evangelism. According to Augustine, the tasks for the Christian teacher are to discover, to teach the contents of the scripture, and to defend scriptural truth when it was attacked. Rhetoric, despite its pagan origins and frequent misuse, could assist the Christian teacher in fulfilling the obligations. Augustine's process of reconciling of rhetoric to his worldview and faith led to his 2 dilemmas. The first dilemma is that a rhetoric of God is both impossible and essential. If Greek rhetoric relied on an objective truth as a source of knowledge and law, the source of truth referred during the medieval period is God, and that the preacher must speak of God. Augustine then used Plato's idea of rhetoric to help the preacher discover divine truth in the scriptures, and used Cicero's idea of teaching, delighting, and moving the audience. The next dilemma is that rhetoric was useful, even vital to confuting the heretics and teaching his own congregation. But it was also a suspect and potentially dangerous art. Augustine acknowledged that rhetoric could help people create better arguments, but can use arguments against the authority of the church. Thus, he responded by writing the Doctrina Christiana, which is a guide of preaching that helps the clergy to read the Bible, preach God, and defend the religion. Augustine achieved the use of classical rhetoric as a basis on creating the rhetoric of the Catholic Church. Augustine also contributed to the study of rhetoric through the use of signs. He believed that the world is divided into things and signs pointing to things. This distinction between the sign and the thing signified helps the Christian preacher discern 2 kinds of meanings in objects encountered in Scripture. Augustine's perspectives on signs contributed to the study of hermeneutics, or the interpretation of texts. The concept of rhetoric during the classical period were considered worldly and political, but Augustine transformed the meaning and purpose of rhetoric into heavenly and divine. The final period of this review will be on the Renaissance period. The development of the printing press, the age of exploration, the birth of the Reformation, and wars led to the prominence of the classical rhetorical tradition as a method of instruction in writing and persuasion. And rhetorical studies are the foundation for a new understanding of the origins and flourishing of civilization as a means of self-improvement and social development. The study of rhetoric flourished in this period because of 2 reasons. First is that resources from classical and medieval rhetoric are available and used by scholars. And the next reason is that rhetoric dominated the thoughts of the Renaissance intellectuals, particularly the humanists, who are responsible for the resurgence of interest in the languages and texts of classical antiquity. The influence of rhetoric not only circled around politics, but also in personal development. Some of the developments of the study of rhetoric in the Renaissance period is the role of rhetoric in emotions and the contribution of rhetorical analysis, particularly in hermeneutics. One of the humanists who contributed to the development of rhetoric was Petrarch. His concept of viva activa, or the life of political and civic involvement, transformed rhetoric as the application of reason to the solution of the practical problems of human social life. Thus, rhetoric became a tool for questioning the status quo and for inaugurating new ways of thinking in Europe. Of course, rhetoric didn't escape from criticisms, especially from Remus, who removed rhetoric's more substantial elements into the discipline of dialectic. However, despite the criticisms it faced, rhetoric became a prominent study in Britain in the 16th century, paving to further development of rhetoric in the modern era and the contemporary period. Rhetoric was acknowledged as useful and essential in all periods of history in this review, despite its criticisms, potential dangers, and skepticisms. The field of rhetoric survived from different threats in history and developed itself from a means to defend oneself in court to a tool for self-development. We also saw the schemas of persuasion of Aristotle and Cicero, along with the concepts of rhetoric of Plato, Quintilian, Augustine, and the humanist scholars. Indeed, rhetoric was seen as a tool to change the fate of an individual, a tool to create order and develop a community, a tool to discover knowledge, a tool to spread religion, and a tool to interpret texts, speeches, and other works of